All right. Welcome, everyone. Over the next half hour, we will be showing you how to create your own narratives using OncoChart's Narrative Builder. On our agenda today, I will introduce our presenters, including me, discuss what brought about Narrative Builder and the current types already in OncoChart. Then we'll dive into a little theory and break down the structure of a narrative. And we'll start showing how-tos, first how to get started in the program itself. And next we'll demonstrate how to edit or customize a narrative of your choosing. Moving forward, we'll demonstrate how to delete or hide a section or an entire narrative. We'll get into the nitty-gritty and talk about the most commonly used settings in Narrative Builder, followed by how to create a brand new narrative using a simple exercise, and we'll name it Physical Therapy just for the sake of training. We'll then top it off and show you how a narrative will function after creating one, and we'll need to talk about what a user needs to do to keep their narrative safe and sound. Finally, we'll wrap it up and answer some questions afterwards. As questions arise, please write them down and email them so we can respond to some questions at the end of the webinar. Keep in mind, if we don't get to your question, we will answer any and all questions after this training, either with a follow-up call or an email. And please note, this webinar is being recorded so you may view it later at any time and use it as a training tool. All right, let's begin. I would like to introduce myself. I'm Susan Abrams, the OncoChart Applications Trainer, and I will show you the how-tos. Jeff Carlin, our COO, will talk about the whys. Jamie Stiegelmeyer, our Director of Technical Operations, will discuss the structure of narratives. And at the end, Jeff and Jamie will field the questions after the demonstration. We'll turn it over to Jeff now to discuss why we created Narrative Builder.
Well, thanks, Susan, and welcome to you all. Thanks for joining us on our first webinar. We're going to make this one of a series. Next one, for what it's worth, just not to give away too many things, it's going to be on meaningful use. Anyway, over the period of years that OncoChart's been out there, our clients have often asked if we could give them a way of adding or editing or creating their own narratives just for their practice, because they have needs that OncoChart perhaps does not address properly. Well, in order to do that, we've created Narrative Builder, which allows users to do just that. They can edit, create, customize narratives to better suit what their needs are. For instance, if you have multiple physicians who have multiple ways of doing a consult note, we can set up a narrative for each one of them. So you can have a workup for Dr. Smith versus a workup for Dr. Jones, and so on. And what OncoChart now is, with the addition of Narrative Builder, is a much more customizable program, really allowing you to set what OncoChart is able to do to exactly what your needs are. Next slide, Susan. Currently in OncoChart, as you probably are aware, we have all these types of narratives. Plus, with Narrative Builder, you now have the opportunity to add any and all of the types of narratives that you want. When Susan does her demo, for instance, later on in the webinar, she'll be doing one on physical therapy. So if you have a situation where you want to do a narrative every time your patient has physical therapy, we'll show you exactly how to create one for that purpose. Anyway, we're ready to go for the basics of the narrative, and I believe Jamie's going to take it from here.
All right, hello everyone. Thanks, Jeff. At this point, we're going to break down the anatomy of a narrative and take a quick look at all the individual components that all together make up a narrative. We'll start at the highest level with narrative types and go to the lowest level, which would be all of the individual answers. Narrative types describes the classification of narrative being created. So E&Ms, clinical treatment plans, and simulations are some of the examples of types that you'd all be familiar with. All the components at lower levels will belong to a specific type and will only appear when that type is selected in the Narrative Builder. Each type can have one or more subcategories. Those are called the narrative forms. Some types, such as continuing physics, will have only one form, while others, like simulations, will have many, like conventional, block check, and 3D. Once we've identified the type and form, the questions will be grouped into topics and groups in order to make up the narrative worksheet. Now we'll show some specific examples. Once defined, the narrative type will appear by name on both the patient calendar and the EMR. For narrative types with multiple forms, the form will also appear by name in the tree view. Once the user has chosen the narrative type and form by dragging the narrative to a date on the calendar, OncoChart will generate the narrative worksheet for users to begin filling out the narrative. Each topic defined in the narrative will be a tab on the worksheet. On each tab, questions will be further categorized into groups, which appear as buttons when the user clicks on the topic. The purpose of the groups is to allow users to select which groups of questions they will answer. Each question has been assigned to a particular group and will only appear once that group has been selected on the worksheet. Many questions will have selectable answers that are defined in the narrative builder. Some questions, however, may not. There are many different ways to define each question. Questions can allow users to select multiple or only a single answer. Some questions also will not have answers defined, and the user must type or dictate in order to answer that question. Later, we will dig into some more of these settings and what they mean. And now we're going to hand it back over to Susan so she can discuss some of the narrative how-tos.
All right, thank you, Jamie, and let's get going. First of all, to access Narrative Builder, you will click on Administration and then Narrative Builder, just as you see. And this is what you will see. Here you'll be able to edit narratives, delete or hide narratives or sections of a narrative, or custom design a completely new narrative or part of a narrative to your center's specifications. Let's begin with how to edit a narrative. We will show you 3 common instances where you can edit a narrative. First, we'll show you how to make a question required. Next, we'll demonstrate how to change narrative text. And finally, we're going to show you how to import an existing segment using a topic of a narrative into another one. First, you need to choose the narrative that you want to edit. Either a very simple one, as you notice here. Notice under type there's only one form, one topic, etc. Or choose a more complex one, such as the initial evaluation. Some centers call this a consult, H&P, workup, etc. Notice that it has many topics and groups associated with it. We're going to choose the more complex one and edit one of its questions. In the following slide, we're going to show you how to make a question required. Making a question required means your users will not be able to skip this question when going through the narrative. A lot of you are familiar with required questions, such as coordination of care. We've decided that one of our questions in the weekly progress note is too important to skip. We will show you how to make this question required on an EM narrative, which stands for the Evaluation and Management category. Always choose from left to right, EM, weekly progress note, MDN, diagnosis, etc., give to patient, and clinical summary provided. Click on Edit, and a dialog box will display asking if you want to edit the question for all narratives or in this narrative only. And be careful here to click the right choice. Then click on the box next to Required. Make sure it has a check mark, and it's done. Here I'm going to show you how to edit, and in this case, add to narrative text in an answer. The information in the narrative answer box will appear in the narrative report form view and when printed. This is what it looks like with the current information in the narrative report. This is before the edit. The question is clinical summary provided with two possible answers, yes and no. We're going to edit yes and type another sentence. After I've edited that, I click on OK, and this is what it looks like in the narrative report. All right, we're going to jump into one of our very useful and powerful tools in editing a narrative, and that is the ability to import from another narrative. In this case, we're going to import a topic from the initial evaluation into a weekly progress note, which will import the group, questions, and any answers associated with it. You will select from left to right, EM, weekly progress note. Make sure the weekly progress note is selected because you're importing into this form. Then under Topics, click on Import Existing. You will get the following dialog box, which will ask you where you're importing from. You will need to know all the way back to the type. Select EM, Initial Evaluation, and we will be importing the topic Medical Decision Making, Diagnosis Management Options. Hit Copy. The following panel shows what this looks like in the narrative when filling out the modified weekly progress note. Notice the new tab here. In summary, we imported a topic from the initial evaluation to the weekly progress note. Watch the flow of the import from the topic called MDN Diagnosis Management Options, groups to questions, questions to answers. It captures everything from the point of import. Just a side note, after you import a topic and you decide you want to edit one of the segments, it will ask you if you want to change the group in all other narratives upon which it is integrated or change only the group in the narrative at hand. Again, choose wisely here. Next, we will show you the particulars of deleting or hiding a part of an entire negative, but first the rules. You can only delete an entire narrative or a part of a narrative that is user created and has not been used in a saved narrative before. For the protection of all using the same narratives, you are not allowed to delete an OncoChart created narrative. However, you can hide a narrative or portion thereof. The next few slides will demonstrate how to delete a topic created by a user. We will also show you how to hide a topic. In this case, I just imported the topic, as you saw, MDN Diagnosis. But upon further examination, I realized this really won't make sense here. I simply right-click on Delete, which should appear here, and it will be removed from this category. If, however, I choose an OncoChart created topic or a topic I've used in a narrative before, when I right-click on it and hit Delete, I would get a message stating that I cannot delete this topic because it's currently in use by at least one narrative. However, I can hide it. Notice the active checkbox. The default is for this to be checked. I need to click on the active checkbox to turn it off, and then make sure Hide Inactive is checked, which it is. It's a default as well. Then it will be hidden from the narrative. We're done with some of the editing functions available. I'll now turn it over to Jamie to discuss the most commonly used settings in Narrative Builder before we go into creating one from scratch.
Okay, thanks, Susan. Each component in OncoChart has a number of different settings. These settings give you, the user, the ability to configure a narrative exactly the way you need it to work. Let's dive in, take a look at some of the most commonly used settings. First, let's talk about the default settings section, which appears at every level from topics on down to answers. Here, components can be deactivated or made to show only for males or females. Notice the default is they will appear for both genders. Some have asked us about the internal note box. This allows you to enter notes about this component that are meant to help you remember the specifics about the purpose of this component and perhaps why it's set up the way it is. An example of an internal note might be a note that would say these narratives, or this topic must be reviewed by a physician, so we turned on the setting to require physician signature. That might be a note you would include here. Now let's talk about some of the settings that help to configure the narrative types. In the CPT text box, enter the CPT that needs to be sent to billing when the narrative is recorded. If the narrative has no CPT, such as most nurse notes, leave this box empty. Some narratives do not require a physician to record them. If, however, a narrative needs to be reviewed by a physician, checking this box would require that it be recorded by a physician. Save templates by ICD-9 allows users to save a narrative of this narrative type as a template at any time. This functionality was designed for clinical treatment plans, but can also be useful for other narrative types. Topic repeat is meant for narratives that are done more than once a day and can be bundled together into a single narrative report. Basic dosimetry and port films are a couple of examples. If Use Templates is turned on, starting a new narrative worksheet will cause OncoChart to search to see if that patient already has a narrative of that type. If it finds one, OncoChart uses the answers from the most recent narrative of the same type for the same patient to populate the new narrative. Narrative forms, as we talked about earlier, are a way to subcategorize the narrative types. As such, they do not have very many settings. One thing I would like to point out is that the CPT can be explicitly defined for each narrative form. If all the narrative forms in a narrative type will send the same CPT, then that would be defined at the type level. Or if they will send no CPT, then the default selection narrative type, as you see here, should be used. Next, we're going to take a look at topics. Remember, each topic represents a tab on the narrative worksheet and a section on the narrative report. If the multi-select setting is turned off, users will only be able to answer questions from one group on this topic. The setting is on by default and typically remains on. It's only turned off for a few special cases. If display questions in paragraph format is checked, OncoChart will take all the answers from this tab and formulate a paragraph on the report. This gives the narrative reports a nice feel similar to a letter. I would note here that special care needs to be taken when setting up the questions in order for the paragraphs to be readable. This is something that the OncoChart support team can help with. The optional header paragraph is a note that will appear in red on the worksheet as your users are generating the narrative. Next, we're going to take a look at groups. Remember, each group represents a button on the narrative worksheet, and groups kind of subcategorize the topics, and similar to forms, there are not a lot of settings for groups. However, you'll notice here the same setting for question building paragraphs from the group is available here. So this would be at the group level instead of the topic level. As we take a look at narrative questions, you'll see that the questions are very configurable. This is what gives narratives its power and usability and flexibility. First, users must decide for each question if their users will be allowed to add their own answers on the fly using the custom answers, or will they allow users to dictate or type in this question. Checking the date format will force users to type in a valid date in order to answer that question. In the same manner, checking the number format will force users to type in a number, and that will allow for decimal points. A memo question does not have any predefined answers and allows the user more space than usual in order to type in the comments or the answer. Memo questions are typically good candidates for dictation if your center is set up to use dictation. Multiple answers allows users to select more than one answer for a question. And required, as we've discussed, checking the required will force users to answer this question before the narrative can be recorded. Save with template. If save with template is not checked, this question will be ignored in any templates. An example of this would be a patient-specific question on a narrative being saved by the ICD-9. So, for instance, consider the question, how many brothers does a patient have? It would not make sense to save that answer to the question in a template for use with another patient, so it would be ignored by the template. We would want to go ahead and uncheck this box. What we call the patient pool or the active patient table in order to autofill questions with answers from other narratives or other portions of OncoChart. In order to turn off autofill for a question, simply remove the value from load from active patient table field. We recommend that you leave the value in the save in field because that will keep the patient pool up to date if you choose to turn autofill back on for this question at a later date. As noted here, if you're unsure at all, please contact OncoChart support team for help with any changes to the autofill section. They are very good at autofills. They know exactly how to set you up. Last, we're going to look at individual answers. I want to note users have the ability to send a CPT along with a modifier to billing based on which answers are selected for a question. Simply put the CPT in this box, and if this answer is chosen, the CPT will be sent to billing when this narrative is recorded. So an example might be a question that says, was a specific procedure performed today? The first answer would be yes, and you would send a CPT along with that answer, and the second answer would be no, and you would not send a CPT with that. Similarly, users can send any procedure to the patient's calendar by selecting it here in this drop-down. This does include user-defined procedures. The narrative answer is the answer that will appear on the report if the user chooses narrative instead of brief. If you'll recall, one of Susan's editing exercises was modifying this text so that it would appear differently on the narrative. Okay, in a minute, Susan's going to show us how to create a narrative from scratch using our physical therapy example. But before she does that, I'm going to explain some more practical examples of the questions that she's going to use. The first question is the number of push-ups that a patient has done. We need to allow typing, but in order to restrict the user to only enter actual numbers, remember that number format is checked. The second question is a date, so we will click Date Format. You'll remember that the user is then forced to enter an actual date. Next is a drop-down that does not allow typing. We do not need to check any extra boxes for this question. We just add the selectable answers from inside of the narrative builder. The next question is similar, but we will allow users to select multiple answers by checking the multiple answers checkbox. We will make the next question required by checking the required checkbox. Remember that users will be able to save, but they will not be able to record this narrative until this question is answered. The last question we'll create is a free type question that allows the user to type or dictate any comments. For this question, we check the memo option. And now Susan's going to show us how to create this physical therapy narrative from the top down.
All right, thanks, Jamie. First of all, I'm going to show you what we're creating, and I'll show you this at the end as well. We're going to create a new narrative that will look like the following report when we're done. So it's going to start off with the name physical therapy, and I'll show you how this is all created. Okay, we're going to start with the type. The type is the name of the classification of narratives and what will appear on the patient calendar and on the narrative report in the EMR. On the following screens, I will guide you through how to create a completely new narrative from the type on down through the hierarchy. We'll use a straightforward example for training purposes. On all of these, you're going to click on New, and the following panel comes up. Type in the name. This is abbreviation, and then the description, and click on OK. And notice it will appear here underneath the narrative types. Next in line is the form. The form name is a subtype of the type of narrative, but you can name the form the same as the type when there is no other subtype. So with the type still selected, same thing here, you're going to click on Add New. The following panel comes up. Type in the form abbreviation and the form description, and after clicking on OK, the name of the narrative form will appear in the second part of the narrative tree. Moving on to topics. Again, with the narrative tree still selected, click on Add New, and the following panel comes up. Type in the topic description, and over here, this will be the name that goes on the tabs when going through the narrative. After clicking on OK, the name of the topics will appear in the third part of the narrative tree, and in this case, we've created 2 topics and called them daily and weekly. Moving on down the line to groups. Again, I can't overemphasize that everything in the tree needs to still be selected. Click on Add New, and the following panel comes up. Type in the group description and the name that will go on the buttons when going through the narrative. Click on OK. The name of the narrative groups will appear in the fourth part of the narrative tree. And we've created 2 groups here, exercises and results. Now moving on down the line to where it's very important, the questions. Everything's still selected, Add New, and the following panel comes up. Type in the question. What you put in this section will appear in the report view. And the short question, what you put in this area will appear here after we click OK and when going through the narrative itself. Click on OK, and the short question name will appear in the 5th part of the narrative tree. We've created 2 sets of questions, one for exercises, one for results. And as you can see, there are 5 questions under the group exercises. Moving on to answers. Some but not all questions will require a list of answers from which to choose, and we will create those here. With the appropriate question selected and the entire tree, click on Add New. The following panel comes up. Type in the answer. Remember, this is the answer, this is the short answer, and this is the box for the narrative answer. So what you put in this area will appear in the answer section and when going through the narrative itself and when viewing or printing the brief narrative. We have created answers for the questions where necessary. We have completed an entire set or tree including questions and answers. So to add exercises now for the weekly section, we can save a lot of time by importing all of the daily exercises into the weekly exercises. To utilize this tool, it is most effective as a time saver if all sections of daily exercises are completed from groups to answers. With the topic selected, we will click on Import Existing in the Groups section. The 2 groups, exercises and results, will then be imported into weekly exercises, including their questions and answers. So as you can see, the groups and answers from daily exercises and results populated into weekly exercises and results with just a few clicks. Just take a moment to look at this. So we have completed a new narrative. The following shows you essentially what you created or we built. Notice that total exercise time is in red, and that was the question we marked as required. So the topics will show up on the tabs. The groups will show up as buttons. The questions will show up here, and the answers will flow in. This shows you a combination of drop-downs, memo form, and a combination list. So let's take a look at what we've created in a report. Types and forms, this is the type and form name. The topics show up in the report as follows, and the groups, questions, and answers are built within. So now we're going to turn it over to Jeff to talk about the do's and the don'ts.
Thanks, Susan. Nice job. I'm sure you're all have brain leakage at this point. There's a lot of information, and we know it's a lot of information. One thing we want to caution you about is to exercise real care when you're editing or deleting questions and answers that are already built into OncoChart. Remember that what you change will be reflected throughout the system, so that if you remove a question because it doesn't fit in your narrative, you're removing it from other narratives as well. When you change it, you're changing it in other narratives as well. Very often you're much better off creating your own question and using that question as the one that appears in your narrative. Make sure particularly that you don't involve yourself with questions that will affect the way OncoChart scores a narrative, specifically the workups, the console notes, or affects in any way what your meaningful use attestation rate is. If your success rate is changed because you've removed a question that meaningful use is looking for, you could affect whether or not you're entitled to the appropriate incentive payment this year. Naming rules are very important when it comes to things like this, and we've been preaching this with clinical treatment plans and other things, other kinds of templates that you can resolve and save over the past few years. This is even more so because, for instance, with a console, let's say we have 3 physicians in a practice, and the practice does not, I don't know why I'm getting an echo. I'm not sure why I'm getting an echo, but I am. I hope it's not coming through on everybody else's set. Anyway, what happens is the naming convention has to be set so that Dr. Smith's console note only appears as Dr. Smith's console note and does not appear anywhere else, so that Dr. Jones does not accidentally take Dr. Smith's note. So a good naming convention would be Smith's console note or Jones' console note. Things that you can see on the screen here, my treatment plan, that is not a good naming convention, and that's not something we recommend. A real caution here is to only edit your own. If you didn't get involved in creating the narrative, don't get involved in editing the narrative unless you're working with the editor, the creator themselves. Inside the practice, make sure you create somebody who's the archivist, somebody who's in charge of all the narratives and with whom all information should flow. That way, one person has control and can maintain that nobody is altering other people's narratives. Susan, can you still hear me? Because that echo just went away.
Yes.
Fine now.
That's funny. Anyway, this is something that should not be handled by tinkerers, not by somebody who just thinks, well, it'd be fun to go create a narrative. You can get yourself in a world of trouble. If you find yourself in a hole, call us. Don't get yourself to the point where you've really destroyed something and you say, oh, now I got a problem. If you think you got a problem, call us. You know, you pay us for support. Let us provide it for you. Our people are very sharp at this. They know what they're doing, and they'll get you out of the hole. Do not forget to work left to right, from the topmost hierarchy down to the lowest most hierarchy. If you start skipping places and trying to build a group without defining your topics, or you try to build answers without defining your questions, you're going to put yourself in some trouble. Make sure you do it left to right. That's my only words of warning. Susan, it's back to you.
All right. All right, everybody, that's a wrap. OncoChart, just to summarize, OncoChart does have many existing narratives, but with Narrative Builder, it is fully customizable. Just be very careful when editing a narrative when many at your center are accessing it. Now, this was just an overview of Narrative Builder. If you need individualized training, please don't hesitate to call our support team. And now I'm going to turn it over to both Jeff and Jamie. Hopefully some people have some questions, and we'll answer them.
All right, yes, thanks, Susan. We have had a couple of questions submitted. If anybody else has a question, it's not too late to submit. We may not be able to answer it during the webinar, but go ahead and send it to webinar@oncochart.com, and we will get back to you with the response. So anytime, feel free to contact or call our support team too. The first question I'm going to take is from Chastity Burnett at Mississippi Cancer Institute. So thanks, Chastity, for submitting this. She wants to know, how do I know that any changes I make in the narrative builder will not be overwritten on my next update? And that's a great question. We want to make sure any changes we make that work is stable, and we don't have to continually check and make sure it doesn't go away. So let me explain the way this works. The changes submitted from OncoChart's end are actually in a separate database called OncoMate. So when we send out updates, the OncoMate database is overwritten with the new information and new questions, answers, things like that. And the overrides that are done at your center are stored in a separate database called the OncoChart database. So it won't overwrite your overrides. So any questions that are still there your changes to those questions will still remain. One thing I would note about that same question is, one thing to watch out for is duplicates. So for instance, if you choose to add an answer to a question, and then we also come across the same conclusion and add the same answer, when that update goes out, you might see that you'll see that answer twice, because you've entered that answer and then we've also entered it in the update as well. So that's something to watch out for. You might see duplicates, but it's no problem. You just go in and hide one of them. You can keep yours and hide ours, or either way. But so that's how we know that any changes you make will stay intact, because they're actually in a separate database. Jeff, did you get the other question that was submitted?
I got another one here, Jamie. This
Okay,
person
great.
wanted to remain anonymous, and the question basically translates into, how am I supposed to remember all this stuff? Nobody expects you to. At this point, this is a 101 course. It's a primer that begins the beginning. All we want to do is give you an overview into what you're going to learn and what you can do with Narrative Builder. The only way you're really going to get good at this is by using it. Work with our support people. I know I keep harping on it, but call them. Use them. They're your resource, and they're there to help you. The more you use it, the more clear this will become. Nobody ever expects anybody to remember what all those checkboxes are for. But as you work through it, you'll get to see it better. We will also continually upgrade the help file for you, and this webinar will be available to you afterwards, so you can replay it anytime you want. Jamie will tell you how to access that. Jamie, you got anything else?
Yeah, I do. I have one more question that was submitted that we have time for. So let's go ahead and answer that question, then we'll talk about how we're going to be able to access the webinar later. This question is, I have my narrative type and my narrative form selected, but there are so many questions shown. Why are there so many questions? And the answer to that is, once the topic and form are selected, you're going to see all the questions that are available to you in that topic and form. So in order to actually see the questions that are in one single group, you need to actually drill all the way down to that group, and then you're just going to see the questions that are available there. And the purpose of that, of course, is so that once you choose your topic, you're going to be able to see which questions are already available to you. So I think that's all we have time for today. So thanks, everyone. We'll be sending an email with a link to be able to download and watch this webinar in the future. So expect that probably sometime early next week. And I think, as Susan said, I think that's a wrap. Thanks, everyone, for joining us.